Welcome back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only show to take place right here, in the space between the turns of your favorite games. I'm Pete Wissinger.
I'm Paul Solomon.
And this is the podcast about decisions in games.
Today we're doing a traditional deep dive decision space style, this time on Fromage, a very popular game from 2024 featuring some very unique and cool mechanisms. But before we do that, we're also going to dip a toe or two into some games featuring simultaneous play, maybe have a chit chat about downtime. Before we do any of that, though, I must say I feel a little bit like the kids the first time the parents have left the house. They're gone. It's just you and me. None of the OG hosts are here, and I'm like, I don't know. What are we gonna do? Like, are we gonna go in the dresser? Like, I want to make them proud, though, honestly. So I'm a little nervous, but excited.
Do you think that you're more the Jake or the Brendan if we're a duo?
Gosh, that's such a good question. I think that I'm gonna be a little bit more of the Brendan, actually.
Okay. Yeah, that makes
Think. And
sense.
I'm curious, actually, on the Discord, if people want to sort of characterize how they
Right.
imagine the styles of our two kind of parents, so to speak. I think of Brendan as very sort of like high-minded in a way. He brings the sort of structure to it that I think is I bring that, I think, a little bit. So we'll sort of see what goes on.
Yeah, and I feel like Jake's the one who tries to be funny a lot. So that sounds like a role I can
That's probably
slip
true.
right into. So
Very good. Well, why don't we dip straight in to our little toe tap on simultaneous games? Because Fromage, for those that don't know, is known for fully simultaneous play. And I'll get into this more in our rules explanation later. But the board is split into 4 sections, and each player acts on one of those sections at a time. Everybody taking their turns completely independently and simultaneously. And then when everybody's done, the board kind of rotates and you get access to another section. And there's a lot of different styles of games that have simultaneous play. I think the main sort of selling point that people talk about and like from these style of games is that there's just basically no downtime, right? I mean that I don't have to wait for you to finish, and I think that that's sort of sometimes a complaint that we hear from designs. Would you agree?
yeah, I actually think that some games have real downtime problems. And I know that this is actually something that bugs you because I remember you telling me that you did not enjoy your one play of El Grande because it took 90 minutes and you only got to take 9 turns.
Yeah, it had a bad turn per time ratio. Yeah. Wasn't
And
happy with
so
the turn per time ratio, but I think it goes a step further than that as well. And I know Jake's talked a lot about the sort of micro turn concept, which sort of reduces the time per turn ratio or increases the turn per time ratio. Um, and I think there's some of that too. But I think part of my problem with El Grande is that it was 9 turns total. I got 9 chances really to make a big splash. So yeah, I think that's part of downtime. But I interrupted you a little bit. You were going to say.
no, I mean that's kind of what I was thinking. But I think that when I think about games with a lot of downtime, a lot of times where it bugs me the most is in games that are more solitaire puzzle games.
Yeah.
Like if you play, say, like Wingspan with 5 players, it's
Hmm.
just going to take longer, even though I am making the same number of decisions as I would in a 2-player game of Wingspan. And, that can be a real turnoff for some people. They even made that flock mode for Wingspan, where if you're playing with 6 or more, then like half of you take turns at the same time, sort of thing.
Very interesting. Yeah.
And it's especially a problem, I think, in games where I can't really plan my turn when it's not my turn. Like
Right.
a lot of downtime in a game where a board state is drastically changing in a way that
Hmm.
I won't be able to respond to till my turn and I can't pre-plan my turn. I think that's where downtime can be a real issue.
I think that's very right. And we hear people say that about sort of like if the game state is too dynamic and it's going to change a ton before my next turn, then I just can't actually spend the intermediate time planning. And I think that's very common in Five Tribes where we're bidding for turn order, but I don't have a clear sense of what the second turn of the round will look like necessarily. Even though everything is pretty laid out on the board and I expect you to do something, I don't necessarily know what you're gonna do. And I also want to go back to Wingspan because the downtime, I think, is something that they directly addressed in maybe the first expansion or something like that, because they added, unless I'm mistaken here, they added a certain types of powers that will activate when an opponent does something. I don't know. Is that in the original game design? I'm not
I
sure.
know it's in Asia,
Right.
but I'm trying to think if those cards are in the original. I was thinking
Yeah. And
like
they, no, go ahead.
yeah, I was thinking like, you're go on and finish what you're saying about Wingspan 'cause I'm gonna hop to something else.
Yeah, no, I just think that that's they have these sort of like once per round when an opponent does such and such a thing, and it the mechanism um pushes you to just pay more attention to what other people are doing. But there are a lot of times, as you've said, where if it's a parallel play multiplayer solitaire game and I don't necessarily care what you're going to do, I'm just sort of maybe looking at my combo and hoping I can pull it off. Even a minute of downtime is just boring, probably, especially if I'm able to plan my hopes for my turn in 15 seconds.
I was gonna say that, a style of game that I think can work for me with downtime, even though it's sort of more parallel play, is some deck builders. Like, if I'm playing
Mhm.
Dominion and I've got, like, a hand that's presenting me a puzzle, and I need to kind of figure out how I'm gonna use that hand, a little bit of downtime helps because then when it's my turn, I can just do it, and I'm not, like, thinking on my turn. So games where I have a lot of agency to play my turn the way I want to regardless. Sometimes a little bit of downtime can help because it allows me to optimize my turn in a way that maybe if we're just constantly playing, that wouldn't happen.
Yeah, I think what we're pulling out here is that you need a good match between sort of plan time and downtime. And that if one of those dramatically exceeds the other, something gets weird. Like if my turn is very easy to plan and my next turn is very easy to plan, but the turns aren't whipping around to me, I end up sitting there. Whereas on the other hand, if the turns are whipping around the table somehow for other people, maybe they're very easy to execute, but the actual planning of what I want to do takes a long time, then that's a problem too. And I've experienced that. I think that's more what we would call analysis paralysis is really what that describes. When we played Haggis most recently, and I was just frozen, I the turn was going to take me 2 seconds. I was going to play a meld of cards to lead a new trick in that game, and but just planning that, I just sort of fell into lost myself in the recursion of trying to plan. And so, yeah, there has to be a nice match between the plan time and the downtime.
And I think this is why our co-hosts and many of the listeners of this show enjoy asynchronous play for some games because they can do that planning without other people having to wait for them.
That's
Right?
true.
If you're the kind of person who likes to maximize the utility of your turn, then this is sort of where asynchronous play becomes an advantage for some people.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Well, so again, simultaneous play games work to undercut this a little bit and keep everybody active kind of all the time. And there's a lot of types of these. I'm going to sort of push into some in betweens as well. I think one of the first types that well, maybe not the first types I experienced, but one of the most kind of in between ways that this is responded to is something like Earth, where it's essentially not my turn, but I'm always going to be doing something when you're active. Or Tiny Towns is another one like this, where there's sort of a bingo style of this is what we're all going to do, and then we all do it. And that keeps everybody involved, even though there are sort of um, moments where I have player agency and you don't, but you still execute and have to stay engaged. Are there other games you can think that sort of have that follow style?
For sure. I mean, one of my favorite games is Race for the Galaxy, and in Race for the Galaxy, everyone takes all the actions. Um, but I think that the reason that Earth was the huge hit that it was is because it takes something like Race for the Galaxy, which is kind of a short filler, not really filler, but it's a short game. It's a small game. And they say, well, what if this was a midweight Euro, right? They
Sure.
really kind of blow it out a lot. And I think a lot of people like that in Earth, you're just kind of always popping. I've only played Earth, I think 2 or 3 times. And the first time I played it, it was actually overwhelming for me
Mhm.
because, a lot of times if you're playing like a Euro game for the first time, it helps to like watch other people take their turns because you're learning by watching other people
True.
who know what they're doing do stuff. But it's like, no, I have to be doing stuff too. It felt like I was getting like buried in the game just by like having to do things the whole time, and it was pretty exhausting. It was less like that the next two times I played. Um, but yeah, the main experience I had was something like that was Race for the Galaxy, but it's a much simpler game.
Yeah, I've worked on a game with the active player chooses something, and then everybody has a choice to follow, and the following is simultaneous, called Watches and Clocks, yet unreleased. But the I had a playtester of that game who said that that experience was exhausting to them because it made them feel like there wasn't enough downtime, right? They were just always had to be engaged with a puzzle that was maybe again, just more demanding than he felt like the time was. And I think in those situations, like even in a game like Earth, you can have someone whose processing time actually creates undesired downtime for every other player. Where if I really want to sit there and think about what I'm doing in Earth or, making some of these micro decisions, it could actually create this place where what was simultaneous play starts to fall off and feel clunky and actually might make you frustrated about the play experience because we're not on the same wavelength about pace.
So what I'm just realizing as you're talking is that um, analysis paralysis, you can feel sometimes when you're doing it, right? You can kind of
Right.
everyone's maybe like being nice, but you can feel when you're the one who's slowing things down. But in most games, that's only happening on my turn, and then I don't feel that pressure anymore. But in a game like Earth, I'm constantly feeling like everyone's waiting on me instead of only on my turn. So if you get stressed when you feel like people are waiting on you, then this kind of game can actually feel even more stressful and exhausting because it's not just on my turn that people are waiting on me, it's on everyone's turn that people are waiting on me.
Yeah, and as we get into talking about Fromage, it'll be interesting to see how much we think that shows up. I did play test at Stonemeyer Design Day another design from the designer of Fromage that has a similar sort of DNA, and I gave some feedback about this because there was a player in our group who was significantly slower, and it just sort of like, I guess it makes the game a little more fragile and a little more group dependent, and that's probably fine. Um, but at least these types of games are subject to it. Let's talk about our next type of simultaneous game. Of course, there's just the classic real time game, right? There are competitive real time games and cooperative real time games. I find a lot of these are cooperative, like Fuse. Chuck dice, try to arrange them, decide how we're going to split them up, or escape the curse of the temple. Everybody's rolling dice at the same time to try to complete some objectives with tile laying and moving around. Other ones you've played in this sort of real-time co-op or competitive space?
Uh, the big one I'm thinking of, or the big two I'm thinking of, are first of all, Atlantis Rising is a real time worker placement game that's
True.
cooperative. Um,
Is it real-time or just simultaneous
well,
play?
it's simultaneous, I guess, right?
Okay.
Yeah,
But there's
that's
no,
fair.
like, time crunch because I think
There's
that's a
not.
little bit of what I'm thinking
Okay,
of.
then that yeah, because the other one I was going to say is another one where it's just like people can just take their turns at the same time, which is co-op. Is the Slay the Spire board game, um,
Right.
which I think that simultaneous cooperation can actually enhance the amount of cooperation you can do in a game, because you have to be like constantly talking to each other while you're doing your stuff.
Yeah.
But you're
I
right; it's
felt
not a
that.
time crunch.
No, and I think there are those types that are like when it's competitive, often it's like, I just wanna be faster than you. That's sort of like a real-time simultaneous play style of game. So, for example, something like, Spot It, where we flip a card, we're all playing simultaneously and just trying to be as fast as we can. That's a time crunch style of simultaneous play. Or on the cooperative side, something like Magic Maze or Kites, where there is a sand timer that is
Mm.
ticking down and we need to manage the sand timers and complete cooperative objectives. That's sort of when I think of real time, that's a little bit what I imagine. But I do also sometimes laugh at that because like all games take place in real time. You continue to play them as time elapses, you know what I mean?
Here's a
Um,
question.
yeah.
Is the mind a simultaneous play game?
Yeah, it is. I think it's very much like the Gang, which I would say is a simultaneous play game in the same way that Atlantis Rising is. And Slay the Spire. You're all deciding how and when to take your turn in this sort of real time floating space, right? It's not a time crunch game, which differentiates it from that other category. But yeah, I'd say that's it's certainly not a turn based game in the same way that a lot of stuff is, right? And maybe that's part of what we're talking about here.
And I see that the next thing you have is that there's real-time competitive games where often in that situation, speed is a key component.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's a couple examples that are similar here. One being Galaxy Trucker, and the other being Fit to Print, which both have this pile of face down tiles in the center, and in real time, under a time crunch generated by the other players. As fast as you can, you look at these tiles and put them back and decide which ones to add to your desk or your ship or whatever. Um, and ultimately, you're trying to do better than other people at creating this, galaxy truck. I don't know what they call it, or creating a newspaper and fit to print. But there's an interesting game in this space which I have not played, and I'm curious if you have played, called Pendulum from Stonemaier. Have you played that?
I've not. I only know it by reputation.
And I know it because one of my first signature disc from Stone Meyer was Pendulum. But a simultaneous play, real time worker placement game. I would say maybe without a time crunch. I'm not exactly sure how Jamie would put that, but there are a series of sand timers that are dictating when you can place in different spots and when you can resolve them. It has what I would call a delayed worker placement. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, where you might place a worker, but you don't get the immediate gratification of its action. You have to wait until the sand timer elapses and then you can remove. Um, but I think, again, I haven't played it, but my understanding of that game is that it isn't this speed race, that there are moments where you're watching and waiting, and it's actually player choice that determines when a sand timer flips back over. And there might be reasons where you wouldn't want to advance the game on one of its three sand timers. So I think that's a really unique and interesting design. I don't think it's the most beloved Stonemaier game of all time, but it's certainly one of the most unique. I can't think of another game like that, like a real-time worker placement game apart from, especially not in the co-op space. Again, we talked about Atlantis Rising, but in the co-op space, I think it stands alone.
Yeah, I think that another game I think of when I think about speed real time games is I really liked when I was younger playing Bananagrams, which
Mm,
Bananagrams is just real time Scrabble.
right.
And I really liked it because I was
Parallel
very
play.
parallel play. I was very fast at it.
Yeah.
And I think that for some people who are just used to Scrabble and the idea that Scrabble is about min maxing for points is a very different kind of experience. But these games that have no downtime like that take advantage of the fact that no downtime is stressful because that's like baked into the game experience.
That's true. That's actually a great point, is a lot of these simultaneous real-time time crunch games, the fun of the game is the time crunch. Whether it's cooperative or competitive, the fun of the game they've built around is that time crunch. And they're not necessarily saying, well, let's take a game that has some downtime issues and let's make it simultaneous. They're just sort of coming at it from a different design perspective, I guess, is what I would say. Um, another so maybe people wouldn't think of this as simultaneous play, but another example I think is pick and pass drafting games, like Sushi Go or Seven Wonders. um, those games scale really well based on player count, because everybody has essentially a hand of cards that they interact with at a time, and then that hand rotates a click and everybody gets to interact with a new one. So it's not so different from what we'll describe in Fromage. And it is simultaneous play. And I absolutely love pick and pass drafting games.
Yeah, Seven Wonders was really big for me when I was first getting into hobby board games. The idea that, like, no matter how many people showed up, we could sit down and play this, have a satisfying strategic tactical experience, and the game time was gonna be the same no matter how many people were playing. The fact that you could play a fun 7-player non-party game in under an hour, just is the reason that that game is such a huge hit.
Yeah. One thing that's interesting about pick and pass drafting that I know they've covered on the show before is it takes a game that feels uh, parallel play. Everybody's interacting with their own packet at a time, but it actually inserts uh, this player interaction in a couple interesting ways. One is that I can hate draft or whatever euphemism you'd like for that. I can look at what you've got coming next and I can take it from you intentionally, maybe to my benefit, maybe to my detriment. Um, the other is that, in something like Seven Wonders, they put me specifically at odds with my neighbor, on both sides, so that I have to pay attention to both of their militaries, and then even at high player counts, that amount of player interaction is the same. I have one person I can hate draft from, I have 2 people I wanna compete with on this category, uh, and so you have a game that is very um, allows you to play independently, allows you to play with little downtime and focused in the way that you want, but also gives you opportunity to play against the people in your play space. I think that's really cool.
For sure. Yeah.
Any other styles of simultaneous games you can imagine?
I mean, I think that you've got another style listed here, which are games where part of it is simultaneous. Like you actually mentioned your game
Mhm.
Stamp Swap, where the interactive part of the game you take turns, but the
Mm.
non-interactive part of the game you just kind of do, right? Which is like
Yeah,
the
that is true.
actual placing of the stamps in your books. So I think that works in some games where it's like uh turn based and then simultaneous. There was one I played called, I think, Fantastic Factories, which is like
Mm.
a dice placement game. And when you're like drafting stuff to add to your factory, that you take turns on because it's a draft. But then when it comes to placing your dice and popping them off, everyone just does it.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember hearing, I think this is why I put it on there. I remember Jamie saying that it's a simultaneous play game, which I never thought of Stamp Swap that way in design and development. But what it achieves, rather than low downtime, is it actually manages the game length similar to what we were talking about with Seven Wonders. Seven Wonders has a very fixed game length at any player count. Whereas you'll actually see on boxes now, some games will say like 15 minutes per player. And that's because they know that each player has about 15 minutes of turns to make in the game. And a game like Stamp Swap, or even Isle of Skye for that matter, has these moments where in Isle of Skye, we all simultaneously do our pricing. And so that part of the game will have kind of a fixed length regardless of player count. But then there is the turn based part where we buy. And then there's the simultaneous part where we put them into our little thing and then simultaneously score. Um, so games like that will have a kind of smaller range for their play length. And that's kind of good. It also gives you the best of both worlds, you might say, um, Hannah Montana style, where you can um, basically have a moment to think carefully and make your turn and have the turn order flow, but also just like a freedom of let me puzzle out my tiles and think how this is going to go.
And I think we're about to get at as we jump into the deep dive is the struggle for a lot of these games is how to make this style of play work in like a medium weight game or a medium to heavyweight game, because most of the games we just mentioned and talked about I would say are light to light medium weight games. um so I think that kind of the new frontier that games like Earth opened up is, well, how do we make simultaneous play work in a medium weight game?
Great point. And with that, we head now to our deep dive. Fantastic. Well, we're here. The moment has arrived. Welcome to my 2024 golden decision of the year. And that game is Fromage, designed by Ben Rossett and Matthew O'Malley, published by R2I Games, Road to Infamy. Um, let's get right into it. Before we've talked a little bit about this, we'll have a full rules overview in a sec, but I thought let's just start with our mini reviews. Let's say whatever you want to say, Pete. I'm going to give you any number of words, and then we'll first rate out of 3 on the Solomon scale.
Solomon scale rating, great. So, I'll start by just saying that Fromage is not what you would call a Pete game.
That is true.
Fromage is very much um, a Euro game where you're playing a bunch of different mini games one at a time, while everyone else is playing those same games in a slightly different configuration. And I think that the game is really neat in the way that it creates player interaction with simultaneous play, mixing with this time track mechanism. The whole thing, I've played the game, I think, 3 times now. No, wait, 4 times now. And the whole game just kind of melts my brain. I think that this game asks me to think in a way that I have trouble thinking. It's got a very high skill ceiling, but um, for my tastes, I think that the parts of the game don't quite come together into a whole that grabs me or excites me all the time. So this is a very firm 2 out of 3 for me on the Solomon scale.
Completely reasonable. Exactly what I thought you'd say. For me, of course, it receives my 2024 Golden Decision of the Year. It is a solid, rock solid 3 out of 3. It's one I'll probably never sell. Let me tell you a little bit about it. Fromage features an incredible time track worker placement system that is incredibly accessible. It brings to mind amazing games like Tzolkin that truly melt the Euro brain and boils it down, or I don't know, do they ferment cheese into a 30 to 45-minute experience that captures everything I want in a Euro game, from a number of interesting and slick puzzles, personal progression, end game scoring, in game effects, variability through a number of different options. Um, Fromage has blown me away from a design perspective. And in my, I think, 4 plays, I've been profoundly impressed by the high skill ceiling that it achieves with a restrained and controlled balance system. So we'll get into that later. Fromage for me, rock solid 3 out of 3. All right. Well, do we want to give the people what they really want and go decision space out of 10, or we leave it right there, Pete? I give you the call.
I think that's totally fair. I think maybe we should do the decision space thing and categorize what type of decision space we think this game has.
Great. Let's start there.
And
I think it's
so,
very clearly uh, a waning decision space. The board starts with a ton of worker placement spaces, maybe, I don't know, 20 or 30 on each wedge, which almost sounds like Feast for Odin level crazy, but they're very simple and easy to comprehend. And as you go through the game, you place cheese on those spaces and the cheese sits there forever. So it just sort of shrinks. Would you just
y-
agree with everything there? Any other wrinkles?
yeah, it's kind of like a worker placement game where someone, when they put a worker somewhere, they block the space, but it's blocked for the whole game.
That's right. That's right. And the worker placement spaces, they make sense to call them that, but they don't have particular actions. The action of every worker placement space is effectively put a cheese here and leave it there. The one thing that I could say that makes it a dynamic worker space, in the teeniest little hint, is that some of the actions you can take will give you additional worker spaces on your player board. And so you do have some additional choices as the game goes on. You will get additional resources that give you options. So there is a little fluctuation in the decision space. But for the most part, the game starts wide open, and as those spaces get tightened down, sometimes you really don't have a move that you want to make at the very end of the game.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, the only waning or only waxing element is, like you said, that you can build out your player board a little bit, which might give you some more options, but otherwise, 100% waning.
Yeah. Well, before we get any further into our analysis here, let me just give a brief rules overview for the people at home. And of course, you can watch your own video. Might be smart, might skip forward to the next thing. But as I said, this was released in 2024, designed by Ben Rossett and Matthew O'Malley, art by Pavel Joba, for 1 to 4 players in 30 to 45 minutes. In Fromage, you're just a small town cheesemaker in early 20th century France, tending to your own little creamery. Life's about three things, Pete: making cheese, aging cheese, and gaining prestige.
Is
Each
that
player
from the
has a
rule book,
personal.
or did
No,
you make that
no,
up?
that's my own. I'm a guy that
Wow.
writes rule books, Pete, and I like to put that kind of stuff in there. You like that?
I
Uh,
do like that.
every player has their own personal upside down personal player mat here, which is where you will track and use your resources and keep track of sort of some of the things you've done through the game that might score. And then, of course, there is a central circular wheel of cheese for the main board, broken into four wedges. And each wedge represents a different venue for cheese. There is the festival, the bistro, the villages, and the shops, and each of those will have their own little mini game for scoring and incentive structures. And during each and every turn of Fromage, players interact with a different wedge of the board, allowing for the completely simultaneous play we've talked about. And on your turn, you may place two workers. All players have 15 cheese tokens and three workers of different types: one that makes soft cheese, one that makes hard cheese, and one that makes blue cheese. And at their bases, you have a little wedge shaped thing and something that indicates their type. And on your turn, you can place two of them onto the board. One can collect resources from the center of the board, and the other can make cheese. And then things pass. A key feature here that will be hard to understand visually or without seeing it visually is that when you place a worker, you decide how long it will work on that task. So it may work for one turn, and then when the board clicks, you'll be able to reclaim that worker, or it might work for two, and then as the board clicks twice before you get that back. And so um, that delayed kind of worker retrieval is a key component of the game. At some point, someone has placed all 15 of their cheese tokens onto the central board, and at that point, the game will end, and the most prestigious fromagier will win the day. That is Fromage, Pete.
Beautiful. I do think that whenever you taught me this game and I played it the first time, there was something so magical about in the explanation that maybe we should say that the board is a sort of lazy Susan sort of situation that rotates 90 degrees. And it's when the worker is facing you that you get
That's
to
right.
pick it up. And I just think
Yeah.
that was so smart and clever.
It's really a really, 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 just that alone is such an incredible design choice. I said this again. The workers have a little cheese wedge at the bottom, and they have a face on one side. And so you will put them on the board pointing in a direction, and as the board spins, it will eventually the wedge will point back to you, and you will see the face of that worker, and then you will be able to retrieve them. Uh, the board also conveys this and signposts this to you by color coding the spaces that you place in. So there are bronze spaces, silver spaces, and gold spaces. Those are the different types of cheese. So when I put my hard cheese worker on a bronze space, I will get that worker back in one turn. But if I put them on a gold space, that cheese will need to age for 3 turns before they face me again and I can recall them. So, as you would imagine, gold spaces have more powerful rewards than bronze or silver spaces.
So I think one thing that maybe it would be a good place to start perhaps is what are the contests that we're competing on each of the wedges? Because each wedge
Yeah,
is sort of like its own little mini game that really almost all of them are about uh blocking out your opponents or like the actual like where you place your workers matters over the course of the whole game.
that's right. In some ways, it's a worker placement game that feels like a tile placement game almost. Let's take, for example, the festival. So the
Okay.
festival has a number of tents. It's essentially a 5 by 5 grid of tents, and each tent has inside of it a cheese. Now, that cheese might be a silver blue cheese, or which might be next to a copper hard cheese or something. And so, in order to place a cheese in one of those spaces, you'll have to use the appropriate worker and point them in that direction. And the scoring incentives here. I should also say there are some spaces that are they're just feature the French flag, and those essentially are wild and they're occupied by everybody. And what you're trying to do is just place the cheeses to make big adjacent clusters of your color of cheese to score ramping points from 2 to 15 points out
Right.
there. So, if you're able to use some of those wilds efficiently, you can do this in a very big way.
Yep.
It's a really yeah, it's an interesting point for this particular board. Maybe we'll talk about the balance later, but each board balances the different types of cheese, the different ages of cheese in clever ways. So the festival is this sort of cheese placement adjacency puzzle. And how does
Yep.
the interaction work there, Pete?
So in that way, it's sort of like a route building game in the way that you can kind of like block other people, right? Like,
Yep.
because I don't have to place adjacent to where I already have a cheese, so you could do some just purely spiteful placement to block off where someone is trying to connect up. So I think that's the interaction there.
Especially the player that is seated next and is going to have a look at that. So you can sort of eye exactly what there is. One important point to note about the strategy of the decisions here is you can see that festival board all the time as it goes around the table. And if you want to plan to get the right space there, you better make sure you have the right color worker when that thing comes around. And I think, Pete, you'll tell me that that's probably that's the part of the game that melts the skull a little bit.
That is the part that's too much for me. I feel like what you just described is the way the game wants me to think while I'm playing the game. And I don't know how many plays deep I would have to be able to think in that way while playing this game.
I'm going to assume that you have not played Tzolkin. Is that true?
That's true. This is my first game of this type. Yeah.
Tzolkin is an absolute brain grinder. And the first time that I played it, I was like, this is insane. Because in this game, I should add, if there's an action space, and there are action spaces in the center that will get you resources, when you place there, you immediately gain those resources. And it's just a question of when you get that worker back. In Tzolkin, you will put them on a wheel and leave them there for some indeterminate time until you choose to retrieve them and get the worker that they are in that turn associated with. And
Mm.
the planning there is just like insane. And that's part of what I love about this game is it takes something like that and makes it accessible in a way that's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, I see that.
Let's take a look at the next one here. We have the Fromagerie, the cheese shop, which features 6 shelves. There's a bronze shelves on the bottom, silver shelves, and gold shelves. And on one side of the cheese shop, it gives you end game points. And on the other side of the cheese shop, it gives you immediate actions that will let you trade resources or gain resources. Um, that's what it does. And here, the point incentive structure is to get onto the different shelves. So it's a sort of disequal set collection game. But again, the interplay comes from blocking the other players.
And so that one that you just showed is probably my least favorite
Hmm.
because the actual decision you make doesn't seem that interesting for me.
Sure.
Um, like I think that that's where this game doesn't quite work for me is because it asks me to think and plan a lot, but I think that the actual decision that I'm making on a space is not for me like a super interesting decision. Like it's like, oh yeah, I want to put it on the different shelves. Like I don't know.
Sure.
Like
Sure.
there's not
I think
quite
that's
enough there.
right. I get what you're saying. I think the incentive, the clarity of the decision space and the incentives is very clear. You
Yes.
know that this is a 3-point space, and you know that the game naturally wants you to spread out. And the only time in the fromagerie that you're not going to do that is to block somebody, or maybe just because that's the only worker type you have right now. So I think that's true. But in the fromagerie, there is an interesting piece. So I should mention something about the way that the resource gathering in the game works. There is a central square which shows the 4 type of resources, and we'll come back to what they are and what they do. There's fruit, livestock, structures, and cards, or maybe they're buildings and cards or something, order cards, and that is associated with a wedge. So as the game progresses turn to turn, you only have access to a certain one of those at a time. So that's another part of the planning puzzle is, am I going to have the fruit that I need for that worker placement spot that I need at the right time? And what the fromagerie does is it gives you a place to exchange resources. So
Mm.
that's an important piece there is it gives you a workaround to potentially um, get something else going. You want to tell the good folks about the ville?
Yeah, I mean, this one's my favorite, obviously. So
This
the
is the
Vila,
most Pete one, I would say.
for sure, because this is an area control game, right? You essentially have these different regions of France that you want to have the majority of cheeses touching each region, and there's spaces to place them that are on the borders of two or maybe even three regions. And so here we simply have an area control game where you're scoring majorities in all of these different regions.
Yep. Very, very straightforward mechanism, but a nice mini game. And then there are point chips in those different regions. So again, the incentives are clear. And everything in this game is perfect information, let's say. Um, but it's unclear. I mean, I can only act when it's in front of me and it passes to you, and maybe you choose to play in there. Maybe you don't have the right worker at that moment. And then the last wedge currently is the bistro, which is a restaurant. And in this game, they focus on cheese pairings, which is sort of an interesting little pun because you have 9 tables, each of which has 2 cheeses on them. And you will score points for the cheese you put in the bistro based on the number of pairings you have. In other words, the number of tables that I have claimed both cheese spaces. So that ramps. If I'm able to get 3 pairings, then my bronze cheeses are 3 points and my gold cheeses are 9 points. But you can fairly easily block me from getting pairings.
Yeah, so this is the easiest one for sort of like hate draft kind of placement because obviously if you have a plate on one table, I can mess you up by just putting the other one on there and then you've been screwed. It is kind of weird though that uh you're also killing your own scoring when you do that.
That's true.
Um
Right, because you're not going to
assuming
get
that
that
you've
pairing either.
correct. And so that's where I've played the game at 3 players and at 2 players. And 2 players, you have so much more control, right? Because while it takes the same number of turns for a wedge to get around to me, only one other person has messed with it in that time.
That's right.
And
That's a good
so
point.
it just feels very different at different player counts, because in the 3-player game, I by the time it gets back to me, who knows,
Sure.
you know?
Right, and 4 player, forget it, right? Um,
Yeah.
the one place that it does, uh, allow you or sort of permit you to block each other, not to your detriment, is if I already have a couple pairings, um, 1 or 2 or whatever, even at 1 pairing, my golds are worth 5 points. So if I
Mhm.
have a single pairing, if I can block you while I put down a gold cheese, well, that's bad for you and great for me.
Mhm.
But this is definitely the most kind of in your face combative space. It feels much tighter than the festival board with the adjacencies. Um, and you can really place a lot of cheese out there for very little return, I would say. One important piece of the design for the bistro is that on your turn, you can place 2 workers. One can get you resources from that central square, and the other can make cheese. So it is not easy, though it is possible, to make 2 cheeses on a turn. And if you can do that in the bistro, you definitely have a pretty clear advantage there.
Yeah, and so on your player board, you have the potential to make up to 4 extra cheeses, I believe. And
Yeah.
so this is what you use the animal resource for. And you have to both build your buildings above it, I think, in order to make the cheese below it. And so that's where the side engine building element comes in. And I will say, it's pretty impressive how good it feels in this game to place an extra cheese on your turn.
Oh, absolutely. Instead of having to wait 4 turns to come back and place that next one. Because if you're placing 15 cheeses, the pace makes it feel like you want to place a cheese every turn if you can. And um, the opportunity to push the pace with an extra cheese outside of that worker cheese is very strong. I think now's a good time to talk about this player board and the resources that are associated with the different options. At the top, we have structures. There are places to add 4 structure tiles that will change and customize and add variability to your personal abilities. In the middle, there are rows of milking stations, which is where you can spend livestock to generate extra cheese. At the bottom, there's a place to use fruit, either for fruited cheeses or jams. Those are needed for some of the honeys. And the last space is order cards. Order cards are a resource you get that just say things like make a gold blue cheese and or a silver blue cheese. And if you can do that, then you get to score that reward, score that order card, and it is worth some number of points, at least 1 additional point, up to 10 points if you're able to do that 6 times in the game. So it just sort of adds a layer of an extra nudge, an extra incentive to consider as you do a worker placement. Um, the milking stations, to be a little more clear here, everybody's board's slightly different, but for 2 livestock, you could place, let's say, a bronze soft cheese. And for 3 livestock, you could place a silver hard cheese. And for 4 livestock, you could place a gold blue cheese. But then if you spend 5 livestock, which is quite a lot of livestock, you could do any cheese of any type. One of the things I love about this, though, is you can get structures that give you abilities to improve your milking stations, right? There's no part of this game that you can't improve in your play of that. You want to
Yeah,
talk about
and
how fruit works a little bit?
well, what I was going to say is I was going to talk about the structures because the structures are where the asymmetry in the game is because each player starts the game with different buildings in their building slots. And so this is the point where we are all incentivized to play the game a little bit differently because some of the structures have scoring elements on them. Like you get points for however many fruit you have or
Yeah,
whatever. And
right.
so I think that for when I've played the game, and I'm not an expert at it, but the first thing I look at is I look at my structures and I say, is it worth it for me to go all in on buildings? Will that be worth the points? I think that that is a big part of your like long term strategy in the game.
Absolutely. Yeah. Each player board comes printed with a worker placement spot that will immediately it's basically excuse me, you will get that worker back immediately. So on this board, for example, you can place a worker to get a livestock at any time, as opposed to just the 1 out of 4 turns when you have the livestock in front of you. So this particular board may want to focus on milking stations. It also has 2 ongoing abilities. And again, all of these are only if you use the structure resource to like activate those powers. Here it says when gaining a fruit, gain an extra fruit, or when placing a cheese in the veal, get an order card. So it's actually incentivizing you to play in whatever direction you like. The last structure, though, is always an end game benefit. In this case, it is a point for every structure you've placed on your buildings. You want to talk about the draft at the start of the game?
Right. So you can draft these building powers instead of using what's already there. And that's when you can really build an asymmetric engine, right?
Yeah, and at the very start of the game, I think you draft 4 of them, and you can choose which ones to use to replace the printed ones.
Right.
And I don't think they recommend it, but you could just play the game the first time without any of that because it's all a front-loaded draft decision that is usually I wouldn't advise as a designer or developer. But it makes for a great second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth play to shape the way that that looks and go, oh, I'm starting to get a synergy in this draft where I'm going to do fruit a lot. Right.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
I think that the order cards are another good thing for someone like me who gets overwhelmed in the game because when I'm like, I mean, I guess I can do this. So an order card gives me a direction to say, like, well, you need to make a bronze soft cheese. And I'm like, okay, well, is this a good wedge to do that? And so I think that those order cards are there to give overwhelmed players a direction.
Totally. Yeah, and the last thing in here is the fruit, and what we didn't say before is that some of the worker placement spots specifically require fruit, and so another part of the decision is, can I place a worker now while I have access to fruit and get them back at the right time to use the fruit to get into the space on the bistro that I need to, etc. Um, but it's not just a resource; it's also a point scoring opportunity. Sometimes you'll use it for fruit, and sometimes you'll use it as jams. And at the end of the game, you will multiply how many of those two you've done. So it's another place where specializing in fruit might give you a big pile of points.
So, can I tell you why this seems like a pretty quintessential Paul game to me,
Yes,
knowing your
please.
taste
Yes,
in
please.
games very well? Because I think you like games where you're told a whole bunch of different ways to score, and you can't do all of them. And you're incentivized to go hard in certain areas. That seems to be the kind of thing that the math loving part of your brain really enjoys.
So there is some stuff in there that's true and some that's not. I definitely like a classic point salad style game with overlaid objectives to compare and consider. I do like that. What I don't like is games where I really can't do all of them. And I'll talk about why that's not true here. But for example, Grand Austria Hotel uh, gives you, it says, well, you can do the thing with the whatever this guy, or you can do the room thing, or you can do the feed the customer thing, but because of the way that the dice draft works and because of the restrictions on the game length and the resources being so tight, you very much cannot do all of those. Whereas in Fromage, you can't have you can't have a fruit engine and a livestock engine, but you're going to interact with all four of those mini modules, and I do like that. I like a game that sort of I actually like games that feed me points a little bit. And drafting games do this a lot where they say, well, you got to take a card. And that card's going to be maybe one, two, three, or 4 points. And in that way, it just says you got to make a choice and interact with something here. And I won't always have the choice to just do a sashimi strategy or whatever. So I do think that's true here. I also very much like the parallel play, partial interaction of the game. But what I think is my favorite part is that it does everything we've just talked about: ongoings, immediate benefits, new worker placement, player shapes, point salad stuff in 45 minutes. Because I don't want to do all of that for 2 hours. It just, maybe it's my ADHD brain, maybe whatever, but I feel I can do so many compelling things and have, even if it's just 15 turns in 45 minutes, it feels really good every time that I do it, and I've built a little thing and pulled a little something off.
Yeah, that's fair. You've told me many times that, like, if you have a 3-hour game night, you'd rather play 5 quick
Take your time.
games than 1 3-hour game.
Yeah, for sure. But, not even close. I mean, if you told me, "Hey, come over, we're gonna play this game for 3 hours," I'd just say, "I'm not gonna come." I'd just rather not show up to do that. And that limits my experience, but hey, so does everything. You have to make choices in life, right?
So, I think that the reason that this doesn't excite me in the way that it does you is that, um, each individual decision I make in this game feels small. And it doesn't necessarily feel like any one decision is terribly interesting. It requires sort of the whole to be greater than the sum of its parts, and for me, it isn't always.
Mhm. And this actually is, I think, a unique piece and a big difference between our taste in games. And it's why I love Phil Walker Harding's design so much. Is I like games that are tightly balanced, so that on every turn you'll score 2, 3, or 4 points. But it's how elegantly you can weave a thread between those turns that will eke out your win. And Fromage is very much a game that does that. Scores will be tight, but at the end of it, you may feel that you have found an efficiency that will get you to the nudged win. And I really love that. And I think even when I haven't done that, because it's tightly balanced, I'm left feeling like that's okay. That's fine. And I've enjoyed the experience along the way. I do not think that's a style of game that you like.
Yeah, it's just not the thing that excites me, in our big 200th episode when I was talking about my favorite decisions, my number 1 was big swingy moves. And that
Mhm.
just doesn't happen in a game like this, which is fine.
Very much does not.
It's not trying to do that. Um I also think that this is a game where you have to be thinking strategically, but you're making moves tactically.
Mhm.
And in order, like if I'm playing a 4-player game, for me to really kind of do the interaction, because each of these boards is a board where you could be intentionally trying to block other players. But in order for me to actually do that, it means that I have to be, while everyone else is taking turns and I'm taking my turn, me paying extra attention to everything. And so I actually think that for decision space listeners who like to play games asynchronously on Board Game Arena, that that would actually enable you to do all the thinking that the game incentivizes you to do.
That's true. And in the very rare moment for me, as you know, I'm going to actually talk about a benefit, as you just have, of playing this on Board Game Arena asynchronously rather than in person, because there is an odd paradox to this game. This game is actually broken depending on your magic circle, and that is um, the let's say that you're sitting to my right. The space that I'm going to have access to next, that I'm planning for, uh, depends on where you place. And so I may want to delay my placement to watch you, but you, of course, are incentivized to do the same thing. And so this has not happened in any of my plays, but the try hard, do it all thinky thinker, actually, if you have a full table of those people, no one may want to take a turn. So it is an ironic thing about this simultaneous, right? And games that run into this problem create places where they make it turn based. And I don't know the extent to which that happens for Fromage. People really run into this, but it could. And on Board Game Arena, I haven't played it there, but I assume we all look at the board, we all lock in our move, and then it reveals everyone's move.
I believe so. And yeah, and that's the thing where like this is where you and I can play games together really well, is because we are both just sort of like try your best and just make a move kinds of players. We're not the sort of like min maxy sorts of I have to make sure that I'm making the most optimal move. So that kind of situation, which actually is hilarious because I can totally see that happening. Where like
Yes.
if I'm trying to win, the game incentivizes me to watch everyone else take their turns and then take my turn.
Yes. Yes.
Um, that never even occurred to me when we were playing it.
Yeah, because if you actually want to make the full decision of a turn, you have to think probably 3 turns in advance, because if you're gonna place a gold cheese, you're not gonna get them back for 3 turns. Which style of cheese am I gonna make this turn? What style of cheese am I gonna make next turn? Are they gonna take my space? Where are my point values? And so the depth of the decision space is actually really deep, I think, right? And, but I just think players for the most part, and certainly you and I, don't interact with it in that way, and it's not really built to be that way. Because it's a 45-minute simultaneous play, I don't think it's asking you to do that.
And what's really funny is that's like a magic circle consideration, but it's not the kind of thing we typically talk about when we talk about magic circle, right?
Right.
Like when we talk about magic circle, it's more about um, behavior connected to the mechanics of a game, I think. Um, but this is a magic circle of like, you kind of have to like put on blinders
Mhm.
when you play.
Right.
Right? It would be almost like if I could see your hand when we're playing a trick-taking game, like, I
Mhm.
shouldn't be looking at it, or I should
Right.
tell you to hide your cards, right? Like, that's what it reminds me of.
It does feel like that. Yeah, I think so. I just listened to your episode, your deep dive on Age of Innovation, which you and I have played, and you know that I Would
Not a
not be
Paul game.
super excited. No, it's not, and I wouldn't be super excited to play it, though I think the design is very cool. I probably have a similar admiration for that as you have for Fromage.
Sure.
Um, but as I listened to you talk about it, you said the thing I love about this game is that I'm forced to think 2, 3, 4 turns ahead. And that is like so typical of a heavy Euro game is that it demands that you do that. But it's also something about this puzzle that makes that very hard for you to do.
Well, and I think that that's the issue with this game compared to our last episode is that the reason I enjoy thinking ahead in Age of Innovation is that the decisions I'm making are interesting to me,
Mm,
whereas thinking ahead in this game is not interesting enough for me to want to put in that same level of mental effort.
that's interesting. The and I think it points a little bit to what I'm saying too about the style. The style of incentives here are not strong enough to engage with your natural incentives for play style, right?
Mhm.
You're naturally incentivized to be excited about play style where you can make a big move and plan for it 3 turns ahead. And I definitely see the way in which Age of Innovation says to you, next round you'll score these points if you can do that. So take this round to get the resources to do this big play because your points really come in fits and starts in Age of Innovation. Whereas here, you're fed 1, 2, 3, 4 points on a turn.
I think another thing though about that style of game in this game as well is like by the time we're doing in-game scoring, I have no idea who's winning.
Sure. Right.
And I prefer that in a medium weight game to not really because there's no score tracker as you're playing in this. Like you do all your
Right.
scoring at the end. Um, and so this is a game where the way I'm happy to play it is just when a wedge shows up in front of me, I take a look at that wedge and I make the move that seems the best at that moment, and then I let it pass on. Which is
Yeah.
probably why it's a 2 for me because I don't think that's a rewarding play style for this game.
Sure. Yeah. I think I typically think 1 turn ahead, but towards the end of the game, when the point incentives on a particular space get high, and I may have seen a space a couple times, and each time I did not have the fruit that I needed for that space. But um, I may start to realize like I really need to get a fruit this time as it goes around. And even that's 4 turns ahead. But it's not like it doesn't feel like a crazy, crazy thing. I wouldn't be the game designer developer I am if I didn't take a little time to talk about the specific ways that they have balanced the game and balanced the time of this game. So the first, we talked about how every worker placement is essentially 1, 2, or 3 time length, and it's really simple the way they did this with the resources. If you place a worker that will take 1 time, you get 1 of the resource. And if it takes 3 time, you get 3 of that resource. And that's very straightforward. And it's obviously balanced in a clearly natural way. Um, then they sort of diminish the value of those resources by making it require 2 of those resources. So they effectively say it requires 2 time to make your bonus bronze cheese. And that again, that's a very restrained balance system that you can the developer designer can understand how that works. But when you get to cheeses, it gets more interesting and just impressive for the elegance. So, taking for example Pete's favorite here, the Ville, which is the 6 region area majority competition. As he said, there are some cheeses that are in the middle of a region; those are bronze. There are some that touch 2 regions; those are silver. And there are some that are on the corners of 3 regions; those are gold. That's just so clean in such a satisfying way that I love that. Or, for example, in the fromagerie, where they have bronze, silver, and gold shelves, on the point side, the bronze is worth a point, the silver is 2 points, and the gold is 3 points. And then they have a similar sort of structure for the conversion of resources. And the last one I'll talk about here is the festival, which again is that adjacency. There are these very important wild spaces that all players have access to that really enhance your connections. And if you have a cheese that is next to 2 wilds, it will require a 3-time gold cheese. Or if it's only adjacent to one of them, it will require a silver cheese. And if it's completely isolated, it will be a 1-time bronze cheese. And here again, that is just such a clean and elegant system. I find that so impressive. It's the kind of thing that I think Phil Walker Harding does well, that I aim to do, because it doesn't just communicate the incentives, it communicates the way that the game is built. It communicates that the game makes sense in a cool way. And to be able to do that with something with this much depth of decision, again in 45 minutes, I'm just so impressed by.
Yeah, I think that what I'll say is that for the type of game that this is, I would rather play it simultaneously than not, right? And I think that this is a situation where, everything is so clear that the individual decisions themselves are intentionally not trying to burn your brain because so much of the rest of the game is burning your brain.
Yeah, yeah, very, very true. Yeah, there are a couple of other games that feature this mechanism, though this is slightly different. I called it earlier, I think I said delayed worker placement or timed worker placement, because um, even though you know the effect of that worker placement immediately, you don't get to retrieve that worker for some duration. And I think that I think it's a really interesting style of game that I'd like to work on. I think the premier high level game of this type is Tzolkin, where God, the puzzle of that game is so crazy. On your turn, you either place one or more workers with uh, more workers costing you more resources, um, or you recall them. And of course, if you can't place a worker, you must recall. So you want to place a lot of them and then recall. That's an efficient play. But you might need them to ride the gear for 3 turns before you pull them off, which means you have to place one and then place another one and then place another one and then pull them all off. And where will they be in sync? And the puzzle there is just crazy town, crazy town. Um, I bet that there's a lot of decision space folks out there, decision nauts that have played this, and I hope to hear your thoughts on the Discord. One other one that I have not played is Arborea, which has these sticks where you place a worker or maybe more, I don't know. But at the end of your turn, all of the sticks that your workers are on will advance a click. Um, and this will continue until you decide to pull off. And when you do take your workers off, everybody else on the stick has the same option. So it creates this punctuated simultaneous play. It's like a follow mechanism. And of course, the longer you ride these sticks up, the better the benefits are. So I'm curious what other games are in that space. Time tracks do this a little bit, like in a Glenmore or etc., where you're a patchwork. You know you're spending a certain amount of time, let's say, and it will be some amount of time before you get to act again. Any other
Yeah,
games?
it's
Have you played anything in that space?
well, I was gonna say it's funny because when you were doing the planning for this, you mentioned that this is a time track game, which is really funny because I didn't think of it like that. Like, I wouldn't have looked at this game and called it a game with a time track, but it totally makes sense that it is. Um, and I think that there's probably a what we talk about episode in that we could do in the future on different mechanisms that play on the concept of a time track.
Yeah. It's also a rondel game, right? It's a rondel game where we're all cycling through the same wedge of actions. We're just doing it one step at a time at the same time.
Yeah.
Um, so it has funny, it just, I think it feels so unique, even though it's grabbing at familiar structures for game design.
Here's a question. What scores do you think Jake and Brendan would give this game if they gave it a couple plays? You think that it's a 2 for both of them? You think they're the only
That's a great
3
question.
hosts?
That's a great question. I think I don't know if Brendan would play it 100 times, and I think it's a top criterion for him to get to 3. Um, but it does, I mean, if Cascadia does it for him, I think this is on a par with that, where the decisions are small and they eke out the win. So,
Mhm.
I'm gonna think that Brendan may give this a 3. I think Jake would go 2 on it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just not
Well,
long enough and big enough for Jake.
sure. And you're placing cheese instead of dice. It just doesn't
Yeah,
make any
yeah, forget it.
sense.
If these were dice,
Oh,
oh my
forget
god,
about it. Forget about it.
forget about it. Awesome. Well, any last minute thoughts here on Fromage before we get out of
I don't think
town?
so. I'm excited for the idea that they're putting out a whole new base game that you can mix and match the wedges. I think
Yeah,
that that is obviously an advantage of the way that they've built this board is that in the future they could just keep making wedges.
yeah. And, that one, of course, is called Formaggio, coming to Kickstarter soon, the Italian game, and yeah, one thing to note about this game is I have the deluxe, but there's not that much deluxe in it. Every copy of Formaggio comes with a triple layered board for the wedges. There's indentations for the cheese, and we didn't even talk about how it scales for player count. There are places to slide underneath these inserts that block things off. I think that's another episode we'll have coming up, which is how games balance for player count. I will tell
I'm
you as a
excited about
developer,
that one.
that is one of the hardest things to do. And I've had some of my biggest knockdown, drag out battles as a developer over how to balance for player count. So
We got to
excited
get
to
that
get
one on the
into that.
books. Yeah.
We got to get it on the books. Might be my next one.
Love
Let's
that.
talk about anything else that's coming up. You've got an episode coming up on mean games. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I've already started the discussion on the Discord. I would like to do an episode on when people call a game mean, what does that mean? And sort of maybe challenge that whole notion.
Yeah,
So that will be coming up for sure. You next week, or I guess you'll be there at the time people are listening to this,
true.
are going to Gamma,
The Gamma
which
trade show, my first time at Gamma, I know there's a lot of people go, but it just never seemed to fit with me. And it's in the middle of the week, and as a teacher, that's tough for me. But yes, this is going to be our first time for Gamehead to get our 6 games out in front of the public, and it's crazy, crazy, crazy exciting. Also, this weekend we have Proto Spiel STL, which is exciting and has been well attended in the past. Um, you have a game to bring, I have maybe a game to bring, and we'll also just get to work with a ton of designers and see some really, really clever, cool ideas. I think that's about it for this episode of Decision Space. Thank you so much for listening. And of course, thank you to our patrons who support this show. You can find that on decisionspacepodcast.com/Patreon. I hope you will join our Discord. We talk about the episodes, all kind of things, new acquisitions, the design space. We play games together. You can follow Decision Space on Twitter and Board Game Geek. You can follow
it's on
me
Blue Sky as well.
on Blue Sky. You can follow me, Paul Solomon 27 on Instagram and Blue Sky. How about you, Pete?
I am on Blue Sky as Pete Wiss, so you can check me out there.
Check him out. You can see all of our most recent game design things. And thank you, as always, to Hembry for our intro outro song, Reach Out. Until next time, keep making those decisions.
Bye, folks.
Close enough.